Sacrificial hooks are one of the main aspects of Dead by Daylight, along with generators, pallets, and window vaults. Each map spawns several hooks placed randomly throughout the environment, as well as a fixed set of basement hooks, and killers can use these hooks to progress their main objective of sacrificing survivors to the entity. This relatively simple concept, which at first glance doesn't have that much to it, actually has quite the complicated history. So in this video we'll be going over the evolution of hooks in Dead by Daylight, and without any further ado, let's get right into it. Dead by Daylight's hooks were inspired by the hooks in the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie, and their concept was already very well planned out in the early prototypes of the game. Even the basement, which at that time was referred to as the meat locker, was already there. We can see from the official Dead by Daylight artbook that the developers wanted each killer to have a unique hook design. And in the early days of the game, every killer had their own personal hook model that was used on every map they played on, which meant that hooks weren't tied to the realm, but instead they were killer dependent. For example, even if you were playing Wraith on Coldwind Farm, the hook's design wouldn't be the one for the actual realm. Instead, the model used would be the one currently found in Autohaven Wreckers. Survivors quickly learned that they could identify who the killer was just by simply taking a look at the design of the nearest hook shortly after spawning. And so, killers like for example Wraith that relied on stealth would have their initial surprise aspect completely gutted. But this wasn't the only way in which hooks back then were different from the hooks today. First of all, almost all animations relating to hooks were significantly longer. For example, the hooking animation was a whole 0.5 seconds longer, while the self-unhook animation took twice as long as it does now. Just look at how slow that is. Furthermore, there was no base kit endurance after being unhooked, as the borrowed time perk hadn't even been added into the game yet. Additionally, something that I've personally never seen anyone else mention before, and that made me really surprised the first time I saw it, is that originally, hook stages were a whole 15 seconds shorter than they are now, which meant that if a survivor was left to die on the hook, they would get sacrificed a half minute quicker than in today's DBD. But by far the most significant difference back then was that if a hook were to be sabotaged, it would remain that way for the entire remaining part of the match and would never respawn. This was compounded by the fact that the minimum distance between hooks was set much higher, and this wasn't even a bug, albeit that the sabotage action took significantly more time to complete. But still, you could destroy every single hook in the map until the only ones left were those in the basement. More on that in my video about the history of sabotaging. As you might have already guessed, some of these designs were quite problematic, and this, along with the fact that most animations needed to be shortened, eventually led to the developers making several changes relating to hooks. Patch 1.2.0 Change. The specific hook model is now dependent on the realm of the map, rather than on the killer. Not only did this fix the problem with survivors knowing which killer it was from the first second they loaded into the match, but this change was also motivated by artistic choices, as the newest hook model at the time, the one in Haddonfield, would have looked very out of place in other realms. Moving on to patch 1.5.0, where the ability for sabotaged hooks to respawn was finally implemented. The original respawn timer was a whopping 180 seconds, which at least could be shortened to 30 seconds by using Hangman's trick when it was added. But before that would happen, patch 1.5.3 increased the maximum duration of hook stages to 60 seconds from the previous 45. The next couple of updates introduced a few long-awaited quality of life changes, including fixing the number of hooks that spawn in the trial grounds to the number of map tiles divided by 3, making it so that survivors have to have regained control of their character model before being able to take damage, halving the self-unhook animation and shortening the survivor hook animation. Meanwhile, the Sabotage playstyle received another nerf with the 2.5.0 update, which implemented several changes to the way that hooks spawn before finally getting completely reworked during patch 3.6.0. The automatic hook repair time was vastly reduced from 180 to 30 seconds. However, the time to sabotage a hook was greatly reduced from 16 to 3 seconds as well. Also, killers could no longer hook survivors mid-sabotage, and skill checks were removed from the sabotage action. After this, several quality of life updates followed. These consisted of draining all of the survivors' remaining life bar instantly in the case that all remaining survivors have reached the struggle phase, and adding additional effects for when survivors attempt to unhook themselves, making it clearer that this is potentially hurtful and will accelerate the sacrifice process. With the release of Chapter 16, Silent Hill, the developers tested a new mechanic for the second hook stage. See, Pyramid Head's cages require the survivor to hit skill checks in order to prevent the sacrifice process from accelerating during the second stage, unlike hooks, which at that time required survivors to repeatedly mash the spacebar button or whichever button that is for a controller. This new mechanic for the Cages of Atonement was generally quite well received by the community, and so, 1 year later it was integrated into the normal hook stages as well. Eventually, the developers chose to update hooks, but not by changing an already existing mechanic, and instead by introducing an entirely new hook type to the game, Scourge Hooks. With the Pinhead PTB in the 5.2.0 update, Behavior added the first Scourge Hook perk to Dead by Daylight. This was Scourge Hook Gift of Pain. Pretty much all of you know how Scourge Hooks work, so I'll just go over that very briefly. When you equip a Scourge Hook perk as a killer, 4 random hooks are turned into Scourge Hooks. These special hooks are highlighted in white to the killer and are visually indistinguishable from regular hooks to the survivors. Depending on the perk, whenever you hook a survivor onto a Scourge Hook, or whenever a survivor gets rescued from one, the perk's effects will come into play. Sounds quite simple, right? Well, yeah, it is. But still, I think this is a really cool concept nonetheless. Over time, more and more Scourge Hook perks got added, for example Pain Resonance and Floods of Rage, and 2 perks got reworked into Scourge Hook ones, these being Monster Shrine and Hangman's Trick. All of these new additions to the game were great, however, there were 2 key aspects relating to hooks that were left almost completely untouched ever since the game's release: camping and tunneling. On the 28th of June 2022, the developers finally decided to address tunneling with the release of the 6.1.0 PTB. In this update, survivors would now receive base kit endurance and a 7% haste status effect for 5 seconds after being unhooked or unhooking themselves, and the effects of borrowed time were changed to extend these 2 status effects by 10 seconds each. Players, however, were quick to realize that these numbers were too tiny to make a significant difference, since killers could very easily just wait out the endurance, and so 1 patch later, the endurance and haste status effects were extended by 5 seconds, and the haste was made to be 10% instead of the previous 7. Survivors finally had a base kit counter to tunneling. 1 year later, on the livestream for Dead by Daylight's 7th anniversary, the developers announced that they will also be adding a new anti-camping mechanic. For now, the only things that we know about this is that it will function the following way. If a killer is standing too close to a hooked survivor for a certain amount of time, that survivor will gain the ability to unhook themselves even during the second stage. We'll see how this plays out when the update releases. Well, I guess that was it. We went through the entire history of hooks in Dead by Daylight. Let me know if I missed anything down in the comments, I would really appreciate it. But anyways, thanks for making it this far into the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!